New York-based lawyer, part-time reporter who wrote the article that I discussed yesterday, and we're discussing again today, about the U.S. government being able to seize the passports of people who it claims are delinquent on $50,000 or more of back taxes, interest, or penalties. And you mentioned, Jacobo, before the break about the tax gap and the government's need to try to close that gap. I mean, I don't want to make it easier for the government to close that gap by raising taxes. I think I would rather have it easier for people to evade those higher taxes because it would put some kind of check on the government. But if the government, once they basically can really box you in every way they can, and they figure you have no way to avoid these taxes, then they have an easier ability to crank them up higher and higher and higher if they think that you can't get out of it. But to the extent that there's a way that people could try to avoid the taxes, one way might be to just leave the country and renounce their citizenship. But if they basically close the exits and build the equivalent of a fence around the country, then you got no choice. You got to stay here. And if you want to eat, you got to work, and then if you got to work, they could tax you.
Well, it's important to note here that this provision that we're talking about in MAP 21, this passport tax provision, doesn't impose any new taxes. So there's certainly a lot of tax policy issues you and I could talk about. What do we want the system to look like? What do we want the rates to be? Are the rates too high? What do we want to change? But it is important that here we're not simply, but we're requiring delinquent taxpayers to satisfy their obligations. So this isn't
it doesn't impose
taxes.
Yeah, but what it's doing is laying the foundation for a more confiscatory tax system because it's trying to prevent people from avoiding what might be horrific tax liabilities in the future. So the government might be anticipating major tax hikes in the future. They might be anticipating that people might not want to pay these taxes. They might want to go to other countries where the tax rates are lower, and so they might want to try to seal the borders and try to prevent the mass exodus.
Perhaps. I mean, it's also important to note that, these kind of constraints do exist already. So this provision that you and I are talking about is actually based off of a rule that allows the State Department to deny passports or revoke passports for people with delinquent child support payments of a lot less than $50,000. In fact, that number is $2,500 or more. And if you look right on the State Department website, it actually says if you owe $2,500 or more in child support, you're not eligible to receive a U.S. passport, and that it could take 2 to 3 weeks after you've paid that debt to start the passport services process application.
Yeah, and I don't, again... Yeah, well, that's a bad precedent, creating even more bad law. To me, that's also unconstitutional because, what does the federal government have to do with state-ordered child support payments? I mean, this is not a federal matter. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that the federal government is there to collect and enforce child support obligations. These are things that need to be handled locally in the local courts where these parental awards are given and where, the child support obligations are given. Clearly, it's not up to the U.S. government to interject in there. And, look, I would feel bad if somebody fathered children and decides to leave the country because they don't want to pay their child support obligations. But, again, we can't have a debtor's prison. The government can't be the policeman and say, if you don't pay this and you don't pay that. I mean, what about unpaid parking tickets? You can't leave the country if you got unpaid parking tickets. I mean, where does it end?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're raising some really, really interesting and important issues about how we want, to use these kind of provisions in the future and what kind of road we're going down. But it's important to know that courts have upheld the statutes about the revocation and denial of passports when it comes to child support payments. And the reason that courts have held that rule as constitutional is because you can contest. You can say, hey, no, I don't owe that amount of money when it comes to the child support laws. And in fact, in this provision as well, and perhaps it was done because someone was basing it off of the child support rules, this provision that you and I are talking about in MAP 21 does the same thing. It gives you a vehicle for disputing or arguing or contesting this tax liability. And for that reason, Some constitutional experts believe that this law also, like the child support payment rule, would be upheld as constitutional.
Well, they might be upheld, but they would only be withheld because the justices are ignoring the Constitution. They're obviously unconstitutional, as is just about everything that the government does these days. But we don't have a lot of time in this segment. I want to ask you, so any reaction beyond, we called you up, but is there any other reaction to your article? Have you been contacted by other people or?
A couple other people have reached out to talk to me about doing some other radio appearances as well. And there are a lot of comments. If you look on the article, it's generated on the Atlantic site, a lot of comments, going either way. People feeling very strongly, some that this is not a constitutional law, that this is crazy, that this is, debtor's prison, as you say, creating a fence around the country that you can't get out of and making it impossible to renounce your citizenship unless you pay, you pay these back taxes. And other people are much more supportive, saying, we got to collect this money. It's not fair when people don't pay their taxes, and they got to pay their taxes, and we should be able to enforce it. So,
pretty soon, Jacoba, the average, each American's personal share of the national debt per capita share exceeds $50,000 right now. So basically, they could just say, hey, you can't get a passport unless you cut a check for your share of the national debt. We don't want you leaving before you had a chance to satisfy this obligation. It is a Pandora's box. It is the camel's nose under the tent. Any reaction in Congress? Have any congressmen or senators come out against this provision and saying that they'll vote against the bill if this provision is there?
No. What's so interesting is that, Senator Boxer has really come out in favor of pushing this bill through. This bill looks very bipartisan right now. You've got Senator Reid, who introduced this amendment. You've got Senator Boxer, who has not come out and said, don't vote. On the contrary, she has said, we have got to pass this transportation bill.
You might want to take a look at another provision in that bill I just reported on before you came on about a requirement that starting in 2015, all new cars in America be equipped with the equivalent of an airplane-style black box that is going to add $4,000 to $5,000 to the price of every new vehicle sold in America.
Yeah, this bill's a behemoth. I have not gotten to that section yet, so
yeah.
So
who knows what else is buried in there. But, Jacoba, thanks a lot for pointing this out and coming on the show today. I wish you the best of luck and keep on talking about this issue. I think it's an important issue. I think it's a lot more important because I think it really comes down to civil liberties and what's left of our constitutional rights. Hey, if people don't like the country, they can vote with their feet. They can leave. If the U.S. government is afraid of people leaving, then don't tax us so much. How about balancing the budget, cutting government spending so that people don't want to leave? Anyway, we'll continue. We got a